She was frozen in the river holding her baby, until the mountain man dived after them. Winter, at the Wyoming frontier. Heavy snow blankets the land, and fierce winds howl through the mountain passes. The wind howled like wolves in the night. Snow slashed across the narrow mountain pass, turning the world into a blur of white. An old wagon, creaking and half buried in frost, rattled forward through the blizzard, wheels slipping on the icy trail. Annabeth clutched her newborn daughter tight to her chest. The child was swaddled in damp wool, her tiny breaths warm against the mother's skin. Beside them, an elderly woman, Annabeth's mother, lay slumped in the wagon bed, barely conscious, lips pale from cold and exhaustion. They didn't look back. They didn't dare. Behind them came Harlan Crawford, the land baron, the man Annabeth had once called husband. Now he hunted them with dogs and bounty men, claiming the baby she carried had no right to exist. "She's no heir," he'd spat the day Annabeth fled. "A girl can't carry the family name. She's a curse, like the last one." The last one, their first daughter, born in secret, buried in silence. And now, he meant to erase this one too. "No woman gives me shame and walks away alive." The wagon groaned as wind slammed against its side. The horses neighed wildly, hooves skidding. A sudden crack. One wheel slipped off the frozen edge of the path. "Hold the baby," Annabeth's mother shouted, before the wagon lurched, toppling sideways into a snowdrift. Annabeth hit the ground hard, her leg twisting beneath her. Her mother was thrown against a tree, where she lay still, unmoving. "Somewhere," the baby cried. Annabeth crawled toward the sound, gasping as pain flared in her ankle. She found the child, scooped her up, and pressed her against her chest, shivering. She could hear them now. The dogs, the men. Torches flickered through the trees behind. Voices barked orders. "Search the ravine! They're close!" With one last glance at her unconscious mother, Annabeth limped into the woods. Snow clung to her skirt, tore at her skin. Her breath came in ragged clouds, but still, she moved. Then, through the trees, a frozen creek, smooth as glass. She hesitated only a second. If she walked on the ice, the snow wouldn't leave tracks. Maybe they'd lose her. She stepped onto the frozen surface, holding the baby tighter. One step, two, crack. A sharp sound echoed across the silence. She froze. Then, another step. Crack. The ice split open beneath her. A scream caught in her throat as she plunged into the black water, baby clutched to her chest. The cold hit like fire. Water filled her boots, her dress, her lungs, but she didn't let go, even as her body stiffened and the world turned dark. She never let go. Minutes later, the hunters arrived. They stood on the snowy bank, looking down at the shattered ice. Beneath the surface, two bodies lay still, one adult, one infant, their limbs frozen in an embrace, faces pale, eyes open wide in shock, like statues carved from grief and ice. The lead rider grunted, "They're dead. No one survives that water." Harlan looked down, face unreadable, then turned away, without a word. Just as the men began to leave, a deep growl echoed from the woods. The wind howled again, louder now. The storm had returned, and something else was coming with it. The snow fell thicker in the silence that followed. The storm still howled above the trees, but here in the hollow of the forest, everything lay still. Beneath a glassy sheet of ice, two pale figures drifted as if suspended in time, mother and child, locked in a final embrace, faces turned upward in frozen defiance against a world that had turned its back. The torchlight from the search party faded into the distance, swallowed by the trees. The only sound now was the sighing wind and the creaking branches heavy with snow. Then, from the deeper shadows, something moved. Jonah Greaves had lived in these woods for over a decade, once a miner, once a man with a family and a name whispered with warmth, now little more than a legend, a ghost wrapped in fur and silence. The townsfolk called him the Snow Beast. They said he had gone mad after surviving the mine collapse that buried 32 men, his wife, and his daughter. They said he talked to trees and howled at the wind. They didn't know he still remembered names. They didn't know he still mourned. He had heard the dogs, the shouts, the wagon's final scream. Now, crouched by the frozen creek, Jonah's breath came out in thick clouds as he peered through the storm at the bodies beneath the ice. Without a word, he removed the heavy fur cloak from his shoulders and dropped it on the bank. Muscles honed by solitude moved without hesitation. He unslung the stone-headed hatchet from his belt and struck the ice once, twice, a third time. The surface cracked, shattered. Frigid water surged up, steam rising in the cold. Jonah stepped into the black water without flinching. There was no rope, no one to pull him back, just the weight of loss behind him and something in front, two souls he refused to let be taken. The cold clawed at his skin, but he didn't stop. He dove beneath, his beard stiffening instantly, his eyes stinging. The water blurred everything, but he found the edge of her shawl, then her arm. Then the tiny bundle pressed against her chest. He pulled. The weight was more than flesh. It was grief, and memory, and something that reached into his marrow and dared him to try. He burst from the surface with a roar, dragging both bodies toward the bank. His hands bled from the jagged ice. His breath rasped, but he didn't stop. On the bank, he pulled them fully from the water, laying the woman gently on the snow. Her skin was pale as moonlight, her lips blue, her arms still wrapped tightly around the child. Jonah crouched low, placing his rough palm against her cheek. No warmth. He turned to the child. The baby didn't cry, didn't move, but she wasn't gone. He could feel it. He leaned closer, placing his ear near her chest. Faint, barely there. A heartbeat. Jonah moved quickly. He wrapped them both in his cloak, pressing the child between their bodies, using his own bulk to shield them from the wind. He rubbed their limbs, whispered words he didn't know he remembered. His own teeth chattered, but his focus was only on them. He lifted the woman into his arms first, careful not to loosen her hold on the baby. Then he stood. Through snow that reached his knees, he carried them into the trees. Not once did he look back. By the time the last torchlight disappeared from the horizon, Jonah was gone. The only trace he left was a single deep footprint on the edge of the bank, and by morning, even that had filled with snow. The wind howled across the mountain ridge, tearing through pine needles and whistling past the jagged cliffs like an old ghost still searching for home. Perched on a narrow ledge carved into the mountain face stood a cabin, more bone than house, its wooden planks grayed by time, its roof patched with hides and bark. A curtain of thick fur swayed gently at the doorway, the only barrier between the icy world outside and the dim flicker of life within. Inside, warmth clung to the air like a fragile promise. A fire crackled low in a stone pit, casting long shadows on the walls. Pelts lined the floor. The scent of pine sap and smoke drifted faintly. Annabeth stirred. Her eyes fluttered open, then widened with panic. Her limbs felt heavy, yet a surge of fear pushed her upright. She was wrapped tightly in layers of fur, her hair still damp, lips cracked from cold. She scanned the room, heart pounding. Where was her baby? A soft sound reached her. A low, melodic whistle, gentle and steady. She turned. In the far corner of the cabin sat a man with a face both wild and worn, his hair long and tangled, beard thick and streaked with white. His eyes, deep and unreadable, were fixed on the tiny bundle in his arms. He rocked gently, his whistle more breath than tune, a lullaby carved by solitude. Her child. Annabeth's cry cracked the air. She tried to rise, stumbled, crawled. The man, Jonah, did not startle. He merely looked up, then carefully stood and crossed the space between them. He knelt. Without a word, he placed the baby into her arms. Annabeth clutched her daughter, sobbing. The little one stirred, eyes blinking open, tiny fingers grasping at nothing. Warm, alive, still crying, Annabeth looked up at the man. Jonah didn't speak. He reached into his coat pocket and placed a small, wooden button into her palm. It was smooth, hand-carved, worn by touch, a child's toy. Then, without a sound, he rose and slipped outside into the snow. Annabeth held her daughter close and looked around. Everything in the cabin was rough but careful. Tools stacked neatly, herbs strung from the beams, a basin with melted snow near the fire. This was not the lair of a beast. It was a place someone had made with care, for someone once loved. She rose slowly, still clutching her child, and stepped outside. The wind bit her skin, but she called out, voice breaking, "Mama?" Jonah stood a few paces away, beside a second shelter, lower, smaller, half covered with pine branches. He gestured silently. Annabeth approached. Inside the lean-to, her mother lay beneath thick blankets, her breathing shallow but steady. A reed tube rested at her lips. Warm broth trickled into her mouth from a pouch suspended above. Her cheeks, though pale, still held color. Alive. Annabeth stared at Jonah, eyes wide with disbelief. He said nothing, only nodded, then turned and walked into the trees. That night, as her child slept swaddled near the fire, and her mother's soft snores filled the small cabin, Annabeth found herself staring at the door. She should leave. She didn't know this man, didn't trust him. Her legs still ached, her future still uncertain. But when she opened the door to flee, bundle ready, baby wrapped, she paused. In the corner, behind the furs and hunting tools, she saw a small wooden chest. She hesitated, then opened it. Inside were several tiny dresses, neatly folded, some faded with time. One had a name stitched carefully in blue thread near the collar, Eliza. A chill swept through her, not from cold, but from understanding. Jonah had known loss. He hadn't saved them out of pity. He had saved them because once, someone had not been saved, because he knew the weight of a child slipping from your arms. She shut the chest and sat beside her sleeping daughter, brushing snowflakes from her tiny lashes. Outside, the wind howled louder. The next morning, her mother awoke with fever. She couldn't travel. Annabeth folded the map Jonah had left, and the wooden knife. She placed them back where he'd set them. She wasn't leaving. Not yet. The days blurred together like snowflakes against a storm-lit sky. For a week, the blizzard showed no signs of mercy. Wind howled through the trees, hurling white sheets across the mountainside. But the little cabin on the cliff held firm, its hearth burning steady, its inhabitants clinging to fragile calm. Jonah came and went like a shadow. Each morning, he left before sunrise, returning by dusk, with game slung over his shoulder or bundles of herbs wrapped in bark. He never entered without wiping the snow from his boots. He never spoke more than a few words, always to Annabeth or the child, never about himself. Annabeth watched him from inside the cabin. She noticed how he stacked stones around the fire pit, always the exact same way, how he checked the window seams for drafts, how, at night, when the baby stirred, he would quietly carve small flutes from hollow reeds and blow soft tunes that calmed her better than any lullaby. It wasn't what he said, it was what he did. Her mother slowly regained strength, though her memory remained fogged. She spoke little, but every now and then, fear would flicker in her eyes. The name Harlan still made her hand tremble. One evening, after the fire had dimmed, and her daughter slept curled in a blanket of furs, Annabeth sat across from Jonah. The silence between them was not heavy. It had become its own kind of language. She broke it. "Did you ever have anyone?" she asked quietly. Jonah didn't answer at first. He stared at the flame for so long she thought he hadn't heard. Then, he reached into the pocket of his coat and pulled out something small, worn from years of touch. He handed it to her. It was a broken bracelet. The leather strap had snapped at the center, the metal plate scuffed, but still legible. E.G. Eliza Greaves, she read aloud, voice barely above a whisper. He nodded once. His voice came rough, as though unused. "My daughter. She was 4. Annabeth waited. My wife and I worked the mine near Briar Ridge. She brought Eliza to visit one day. He swallowed. That was the day the shaft collapsed. He didn't speak of how he survived, only that no one else had, and that when the rescuers found him 3 days later, digging with bloodied hands, he hadn't spoken a word since. They said, "I lost my mind," he muttered. "Maybe I did." She didn't ask how he ended up in the mountains. She already knew. Some men buried their grief. Jonah had built a house around his. Later that night, as her mother drifted into a rare, fever-free sleep, she turned to Jonah. "You saved her before," her mother murmured. "The mine. It was you. I saw your face." Jonah didn't deny it. He stood near the doorway, still holding his axe, snow melting at his feet. Annabeth's breath caught. "Why didn't you say anything?" He looked at her, those tired, kind eyes. Gratitude fades, but living, that's thanks enough. The next morning, while her daughter napped and her mother rested by the fire, Annabeth took something from the trunk where she kept their meager belongings. She approached Jonah, holding it carefully. It was a scrap of leather, old, torn from the coat he'd worn the day he pulled them from the river. "I meant to sew it into a toy," she said, but she wouldn't let go of it. Every time the wind howled, she'd curl around it like it held back the cold. Jonah said nothing, watching her quietly. "She doesn't know what a father is. But when I ask her, 'Who pulled you from the ice?' she holds this and looks toward the door." Annabeth's voice broke. "She doesn't remember her father, but she remembers you." Jonah's expression didn't change, but something in his shoulders softened. The next morning, he was gone. No note, no goodbye. But when Annabeth stepped outside, the snow freshly fallen, she found something waiting on the threshold, a pair of tiny shoes, hand-stitched from thick hide. They fit her daughter perfectly, and though the snow covered his tracks within the hour, Annabeth knew he was still out there, watching, not as a ghost of the past, but as the guardian she never asked for, and never stopped hoping existed. 2 weeks had passed since the night Jonah left the leather shoes on the cabin threshold. The blizzard was finally giving way to the early stirrings of spring. Snow still clung to the northern shadows of the forest, but patches of earth and frozen moss began to show through. The creek, once a solid mirror of ice, now trickled with water as the thaw began. Annabeth, her mother, and her daughter had started building a small shelter of their own just beyond the cabin, near the creek where the light touched longer each day. It wasn't much, logs stacked, animal skins stretched between trees, but it was theirs, a place not borrowed, not hidden, a place where they planned to rest until it was safe to move south. But safety, like spring, had a way of being cruelly delayed. Jonah returned one evening, face grim, coat damp with melted snow. He held something in his hand. "They're coming," he said simply, voice low but firm. Annabeth felt her breath catch. Her mother, seated by the fire, looked up with hollow eyes. The baby stirred in her sling, sensing the tension in the air. Jonah unrolled the damp parchment he carried, a bounty notice. On it, a rough charcoal sketch of Annabeth's face, wild hair and sharp eyes, stared back at her. Beneath, bold letters read, "Wanted, alive, dead if resisting. Abducted child of Harlan Crawford." Her hands trembled as she clutched the paper. He's calling her his now. Jonah didn't answer. He didn't need to. Behind her, her mother whispered, "He won't stop until one of you is dead." But Annabeth didn't weep. Not this time. "We're not running," she said quietly, voice steady like the creek behind them. Jonah nodded once, as if he'd been waiting to hear those words. He reached into his coat again and handed her something soft, a small velvet pouch. Inside, nestled against each other, were 2 halves of a broken ring. "My wife wore the other piece," he said. "I've carried this since the mine. It's a promise that no one else will be left to die alone in the snow." That night, preparation began. Jonah walked the ridge, laying snares and tripwires. He carved shooting holes into the rock walls that overlooked the narrow pass. Annabeth followed him through the dusk, learning how to reload a rifle. how to aim without trembling. Her mother brewed salves and tinctures by firelight, painkillers, coagulants, smoke bombs made from pine sap and dry bark. No one in that camp was helpless anymore. The next morning, they sharpened knives, reinforced the shelter's walls, and packed essentials for the baby: milk powder, a sling, blankets. The fire burned lower, quieter. The air had changed, and when the sun slipped behind the mountains that evening, a heavy silence fell with it. Annabeth stood near the edge of the woods, watching fog rise from the thawing earth. Somewhere in that gray veil, wolves howled once and fell silent. Then came the sound they'd all been waiting for: hooves crunching old snow, chains clinking, men cursing, dogs barking. A faint, rhythmic drumbeat of death approaching from the valley. The mountain held its breath, and so did they. In the shadows, Jonah pressed his hand to Annabeth's shoulder. "They'll come before dawn," he whispered, "but this time it's them who won't leave with what they came for." Far below, torches lit up like flickering stars beneath the ridge, and Annabeth, with the child pressed close to her chest, felt no fear, only fire. The mountain's breath came sharp and cold. High above the tree line, in a narrow gulch carved by time and wind, the snow had hardened into glass. The setting sun cast a blood-tinged light over the ridges, painting the rocks in shades of fire and frost. Jonah crouched in the shadows near the cliff's edge, eyes scanning the paths below. The bounty hunters had split. The main force was following him deeper into the gorge, where the wind screamed like ghosts through stone, just as he'd hoped. Behind him, far from the ambush, Annabeth stayed behind to guard the shelter. She stood in the doorway, gun tight in her hands. Inside, her mother heated water over the fire, blade tucked in her sleeve, eyes sharp with memory. Then came the rustle, the faintest shift in the snow behind the shelter. A man appeared, silent as a wolf, scarred face, leather gloves, knife drawn. Annabeth didn't scream. She kept her eyes on him, shifting slightly, her hand brushing a bundle beside the fire. The baby's cry rang from the back corner of the tent. The intruder grinned and lunged toward the sound. But what he seized was not a child. It was a tiny, empty dress stitched with the name Eliza, a decoy. Annabeth's real daughter was tucked in her mother's arms, behind a screen of fur blankets. The hunter turned, too late. Annabeth slammed a log from the hearth into his temple. He stumbled, crashing into the fire pit, his coat catching flame. Shrieking, he rolled and vanished into the night, trailing smoke and curses. Back in the ravine, the true confrontation waited. Jonah stepped out onto the icy ledge as Harlan Crawford emerged from the rocks below, cloaked in a white fur coat trimmed in silver. The family crest gleamed on his belt buckle, and in his gloved hands he held a silver-inlaid rifle. "Jonah Greaves," Harlan drawled, cocking the gun. "So you're the mountain ghost. I thought you died like the rest of those bastards in the mine." Jonah said nothing at first. His breath came in slow clouds, his face was streaked with dried blood, eyes steady. "You abandoned that mine," Jonah finally said. "You sealed those men in, called it a collapse. And now you call yourself a father." Harlan laughed, cold and sharp. "Women, children, snow, all fragile things pretending to matter. But the law, my name, is iron." They didn't speak again. The rifle cracked, but Jonah had already moved. Snow exploded between them. Jonah charged, blade flashing in one hand. They collided like wolves, rolling through the drifts. The rifle clattered aside. The knife slashed. Blood splattered on snow. Jonah slammed into Harlan's chest, sending the man skidding backward. Harlan lost his footing, heels slipping off the ridge. His arms pinwheeled. He fell. But not all the way. One hand caught a narrow ledge. His body swung, legs dangling into the void. He screamed. Jonah stood above him, blood dripping from a cut across his brow. In his grip, the knife trembled. "Help me!" Harlan cried, terror seizing him. "I don't want to die." "You wanted them dead," Jonah said, voice flat. "You put a price on a child's head." "I was wrong," Harlan wailed. "I was scared. I thought girls meant weakness. I thought it'd all be taken from me." Jonah hesitated. Then, slowly, he knelt. He tossed the blade aside, reached down, and with every ounce of strength left in him, pulled Harlan back from the edge. The man collapsed in the snow, gasping. He looked up at Jonah with disbelief, trembling. "You should have let me fall," he whispered. Jonah stood over him, breathing hard. "Killing you is easy, but she deserves a life that doesn't start with another death." Harlan sat up, eyes wide, then lowered his head. "I lost everything trying to protect a name, but I never protected a soul." His voice broke. He wasn't a lord now, not a husband, not a father, just a man, knees in the snow, watching everything he once was melt beneath him. Jonah walked away without another word. From a ridge above, Annabeth had watched it all, her rifle clutched but unused, her eyes welled, not from relief, but from something deeper, forgiveness. The wind softened, clouds pulled back, and for the first time in weeks, sunlight spilled through the pass. It fell upon the blood-streaked snow. Then, gently, the red began to fade, and the mountain breathed again. The storm had passed. Snow still clung to the rocks and pine needles, but the sky had cleared. The wind no longer screamed. It whispered, brushing through the trees, as if the mountain itself were breathing easier. Inside the small wooden cabin clinging to the cliffside, the fire had burned low. Annabeth tucked the last corner of the blanket over her mother and daughter, both resting peacefully. The scars of the battle lingered, scorch marks on the floor, a shattered bowl in the corner, but the quiet that followed was no longer hollow. It was warm. Jonah was nowhere inside. She found him standing on the cliff's edge, beneath the towering pine he had spoken of only once, where he'd buried his wife and child long ago. He didn't turn when she approached, only stood there, hands buried in his coat, eyes on the valley far below. In her hands, Annabeth carried a small wooden box. Inside it were the ashes of the tiny, hand-stitched dress, burned during the fight, the one with Eliza, embroidered in fading thread. She stepped beside him and knelt at the base of the tree, brushing snow away with careful fingers. Next to the pair of stones marking his family's grave, she placed the box gently on the earth. "My daughter doesn't have a grave," she said softly. "But here, there was once a mother, a father, a child. Maybe it's right they rest near each other." Jonah didn't speak at first. Then, slowly, he reached into the inner pocket of his coat and pulled out a small silver hairpin, delicate, dulled with age, shaped like a wing. "The last thing she wore," he murmured. "I kept it because I couldn't keep her. But you saved 3 lives. I think it's yours now." She took it with trembling hands. From the cabin, a voice called faintly. Her mother had woken and sat in the doorway, a blanket around her shoulders. On her lap, the baby clapped and babbled, tiny syllables that meant nothing and everything at once. "Ma, ma, ma," the child said, then pointed toward Jonah. Annabeth laughed, brushing her eyes. "She can't talk yet, but she knows who lights the fire every night." Later that day, Annabeth sat stitching in the quiet. Jonah's torn coat, the one he'd wrapped them in that frozen night, had been turned into something new, a soft jacket, just the right size for a growing child. Her mother entered then, carrying a folded bundle, an old scarf, woven from pale wool, with lace along the edge. She placed it gently in Annabeth's lap. "My grandmother wore this the day she married," the older woman said. "I had hoped to give it to you when the time was right, but perhaps that time isn't a ceremony. Maybe it's a choice." She smiled. "A girl must go somewhere. This time, let her go with someone worthy." Outside, Jonah was working with wood salvaged from the ruined shed, rebuilding an old wagon with new wheels carved from pine. He said little, but his hands moved with care. They were getting ready to leave the mountain. At the edge of the clearing, the trees opened to reveal the narrow trail that would take them south, to the borderlands, where whispers of freedom rustled in the tall grass. Just before they set off, Annabeth paused at the grave again. She knelt once more beside Eliza's stone. "My daughter," she said softly, "will grow up knowing that her father was a man who kept his word, even when the world didn't keep its promises to him." Jonah came to her quietly. He placed a gentle hand on her shoulder and sat beside her. "We're not running anymore," he said. "We stopped, and the roots, they've taken hold." That night, they sat on the porch of their new home, a modest wooden cabin framed by prairie grass and golden light. The sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the land. Their daughter slept inside, wrapped in a quilt stitched with symbols from two families that had once been strangers. Annabeth leaned her head against Jonah's shoulder. "You didn't just save us," she said softly. "You saved something I thought had died a long time ago, trust." Jonah shook his head. "You saved me," he said. "You pulled me from the ice without ever touching the water." Later that week, their daughter came to them with a crumpled piece of paper in hand. It was a child's drawing, rough, unbalanced lines, and colors that bled over each other. But the image was clear. 3 people, hand in hand, standing beneath a tall pine tree. Behind them, the sun was rising. She held it up and said, "Mama, Papa." Jonah looked at the drawing for a long time, then gave a quiet smile. "She doesn't remember the past," he murmured, "but she remembers warmth." As laughter echoed from the cabin and the prairie wind danced across the fields, the story didn't close with running, or hiding, or fighting. It ended with staying, and choosing to belong. If this story of snowbound survival, unexpected compassion, and love born in the unlikeliest of places moved you, don't let the fire die here. Hit that hype button to keep these stories alive, and subscribe to Wild West Love Stories for more tales of grit, heart, and redemption on the rugged frontier. Every story is a journey, and we're just getting started. Jonah came to her quietly. He placed a gentle hand on her shoulder and sat beside her. "We're not running anymore," he said. "We stopped, and the roots, they've taken hold." That night, they sat on the porch of their new home, a modest wooden cabin framed by prairie grass and golden light. The sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the land. Their daughter slept inside, wrapped in a quilt stitched with symbols from two families that had once been strangers. Annabeth leaned her head against Jonah's shoulder. "You didn't just save us," she said softly. "You saved something I thought had died a long time ago, trust." Jonah shook his head. "You saved me," he said. "You pulled me from the ice without ever touching the water." Later that week, their daughter came to them with a crumpled piece of paper in hand. It was a child's drawing, rough, unbalanced lines, and colors that bled over each other. But the image was clear. 3 people, hand in hand, standing beneath a tall pine tree. Behind them, the sun was rising. She held it up and said, "Mama, Papa." Jonah looked at the drawing for a long time, then gave a quiet smile. "She doesn't remember the past," he murmured, "but she remembers warmth." As laughter echoed from the cabin and the prairie wind danced across the fields, the story didn't close with running, or hiding, or fighting. It ended with staying, and choosing to belong. If this story of snowbound survival, unexpected compassion, and love born in the unlikeliest of places moved you, don't let the fire die here. Hit that hype button to keep these stories alive, and subscribe to Wild West Love Stories for more tales of grit, heart, and redemption on the rugged frontier. Every story is a journey, and we're just getting started.